So this is the second of going to be, I guess, 4 lectures dealing with Kyivan Rus, or the state of Rus. The year 972, which we ended with last time, marks the death of Prince Sviatoslav, and that is an important turning point in the history of Rus. It's a turning point between what might be called the era of growth and expansion and the era of consolidation. And so I've put here on the board 4 eras, which we will be referring to in the next several lectures. Last time we spoke about the era of growth and expansion, and today we will be discussing the era of consolidation and also disintegration. But this first of these 2 eras begins with after the death of Sviatoslav. Now, during this era of growth and expansion that we discussed last time, beginning with the reign of Oleg back in the late 9th century in 878, and that lasted until the death of Sviatoslav in 972. The Varangian rulers, the Varangian Rus rulers, carried on the tradition of marauding, conquest over subject peoples or peoples that they subjected, and that kind of tradition, as we saw from the very beginning of this course, goes back on Ukrainian territory to the 1st millennium BC. We saw that with the Scythians, succeeded by several other of those tribal peoples from Central Asia. The most recent of them being the Khazars and the Khazar Khaganate that we dwelt on. And so just simply following, in many ways, the footsteps of those predecessors, the Varangians from their base in Kyiv, and with the support of the East Slavic population, by the way, by now, into which they were rapidly assimilating. Even when I was putting up the names, I put Svinalt first, and then I figured, well, let's stick with the Slavic name, Sviatoslav. But those, in that first period, they all still carried and used their Varangian names. But certainly by this second period, the second era, the assimilation process took place, and they, for all intents and purposes, became assimilated to the East Slavic peoples among whom or over whom they ruled. And we saw how they attempted to build this large sphere of influence. I prefer to use that than empire or state or whatever, which are more modern terms, and that sphere of influence which would stretch from the Baltic Sea or the Varangian Sea in the north to the Black Sea in the south, and also preferably from the Carpathians here to the Caspian Sea, which would of course incorporate the Khazar Khaganate. Their aim was to control the valuable trade routes through this vast region, which included the Baltic, Black Sea, Caspian routes that we discussed last time and that are marked on this map. The Saracen route, as it was known, to the Khazar Khaganate, and the route from the Varangians to the Byzantine Greeks that went right through Kyiv. Now, in these, one might say, imperial quests, the Varangian Rus and their princes for almost a century until the death of Sviatoslav, directed their efforts against those forces which they perceived as stumbling blocks to what they wanted to achieve, namely the Byzantine Empire to the south, but in particular closer to them in the southwest, the Khazar Khaganate. Now, while Kyiv's era of expansion between the late 9th and late 10th centuries resulted in an enormous territorial growth of the Rus realm, as well as a certain degree of internal consolidation under the hegemony of princes resident in Kyiv. At the very same time, it also removed its eastern trading rival, the Khazar Khaganate, the result of which opened up the steppe to further invasions from the east, a story that is not going to go away. And that's what we have up and through the reign of Sviatoslav. Now, the first 6 years after Sviatoslav's death, between that would be 972 to 978, these are marked by a war of succession. The details I'm going to talk about very briefly, but nonetheless. But what's important to keep in mind is that these wars of succession, very often, maybe too often, were to become a common phenomenon in the history of Kyivan Rus, even during its so-called era of consolidation that we're going to be talking about. Now, again, the details of this first war of succession are in many ways unimportant in themselves, but they point to a pattern that was to repeat itself over and over again. And so, what happened? Before he died in 972, he was returning from a campaign in Bulgaria directed toward the Bulgars as well as the Byzantine Empire. But before that, he had left instructions for the order of succession that was to follow after him. And in the typical Varangian tradition, he designated his oldest son, as you can see the three there, Yaroslav, as the senior or the grand prince of Kyiv. His second son, Oleg, he placed as ruler over that East Slavic tribe just west of Kyiv, the Derevlyanians, who was always causing a problem. You couldn't control them, just west of Kyiv. So now he places his oldest son there. And then the son of his concubine, who would have been the half-brother of the other two, placed him in the north as ruler of Novgorod, way up in the north, one of the earliest places where the Varangians had come. Now, many of the East Slavic tribal groupings within Rus territory had by this time become attached, very jealous in this attachment and protective of their own land and their own self-rule, kind of autonomy. And that was only enhanced by the fact that they had their own princes from the dynastic line that goes back to the first Varangian ruler, Rurik, the Rurikids. And then you add to this human resentment and jealousy that arises in even the most brotherly or fraternal of families, and you have all the potential for civil strife, and that is exactly what occurred. Listening to the advice of one of the Varangian warriors in his retinue, the prince resident in Kyiv, Sviatoslav's oldest son, Yaroslav, attacks his brother Oleg and kills him, or is killed in battle. And when this happens, that half-brother up in the north, Novgorod, that is Volodymyr, feared for his own life. What does he do? He flees back to Scandinavia and then returns with a retinue of Varangians and leads his own Slavic peoples from the north, Novgorod, in an attack on Kyiv. And in this ensuing conflict, Yaropolk was murdered, and in 980, Volodymyr becomes the senior or grand prince of Kyiv, of Rus. Now, the point of relating this history of the War of Succession after Sviatoslav's death is to highlight the shortcomings related to the succession of power in the realm of Rus. Despite repeated and destructive fratricidal wars, which almost occurred at the death of each senior ruler, Grand Prince of Kyiv, despite that, the system of dividing the realm between all the sons of the Kyivan ruler continued for several decades. Now, I'm not intending here, because of time and also because there are readings that you can do, I'm not going to relate in any detail the rather complicated political history of Rus. Let us just simply say here that, like other medieval entities throughout Europe at the time, Rus was a conglomerate of several lands, each with its own ruler. And that ruler, more often than not, conducted a policy that was independent, if not sometimes diametrically opposed, to the supposed senior member of the Rurikid ruling dynasty, the Grand Prince in Kyiv. And as a result, most of Rus political history is marked, on the one hand, by internal struggles among the various princes of these lands fighting against each other, as well as against the Grand Prince in Kyiv. And on the other hand, the efforts of that Grand Prince to enforce his authority throughout the realm as a whole. There were, however, a few rulers who, in fact, did succeed in obtaining a modicum of political unity throughout Kyivan Rus. And it's the activity of these that should at least be mentioned. And therefore, under our era of consolidation, here are, quote unquote, the big three. And we're going to take a look at each of them. Volodymyr I, known as the Great, Yaroslav the Wise, Yaroslav I, known as the Wise, and Volodymyr II, Monomach. The first of these big three Kievan rulers during this era in question was Volodymyr, Valdemar in Scandinavian. He was subsequently given the epithet Great, reigned, as you see, from 980 to 1015. And it was under his reign that Kyivan Rus reached its greatest territorial extent. And this was a result of policy of fierce military campaigning, described somewhat prosaically in those chronicles that we talked about as, quote unquote, the gathering of the lands of Rus. Now, you will remember from pre-Kievan and pre-Varangian times that Eastern Europe was divided among various Slavic, Baltic, and Finnic tribes, each with its own administration and a degree of self-rule. The more important of these tribes in or on present-day Ukrainian territory were the Polyanians in the very center, right to the left, those problematic Derevlyanians, the Severians, farther south, the Ulichians, Tvertsians. And of course, there were other East Slavic tribes farther north in present-day Belarus and Russian territory. Now, after the first Kyivan princes brought under their hegemony these various tribes, hesitate to say that they united them, but certainly brought them under their hegemony, and then placed their own offspring, their sons, to rule over each of them. The city where the local ruler was established soon gave its name to the territory surrounding it. And so there arose various lands, eventually principalities, such as Kyiv. And so this is where we need to know our map. And I'll look now at this map. So here we have Kyiv, Chernihiv to the north, in the far west, Volodymyr, Przemysl, yet still farther west, and even an outpost way in the south called Tmutorokan around the Straits of Kerch that straddle eastern Crimea and the western part of Rus, or present-day Russia, where that infamous bridge is now located. That was a kind of outpost of Kyivan Rus. As for the name Rus itself, it only gradually came to be considered as a descriptor for all of the lands in question, because originally Rus referred only to this dark area surrounding Kyiv. That is the city of Kyiv, Pechenegs, Chernihiv, Novgorod, Seversky. That was kind of Rus par excellence. But eventually that term came to mean the entire realm, as we're going to see. Now, with the growth of the Kyivan Grand Prince's influence, especially under the leadership of Valdemar, Rus began to be associated under him with all of those territories and all of those inhabitants. Not only under him, but under his offspring. And the senior prince, of course, resided, or the senior, in Kyiv. And then derivative branches of the dynasty, the Rurikid dynasty, in those different principalities. The point to remember is that the Rus realm, Kyivan Rus, like other medieval formations, was not a unified state in the modern sense of the word, but rather a loose federation of various lands or principalities tenuously linked together by rulers, princes, whose genealogical ties are based on a common relationship to the Rurikid dynasty. And also we should keep in mind that the boundaries of the Rus realm as a whole, and also the boundaries of its individual principalities, such as we see, should never be considered definitive, clear-cut, or fixed borders at any one period of time. Of course, that's the visual effect one gets from historical maps, though you notice this is not a hard line, this is a kind of shading, so this is kind of the farthest extent of the Rus realm at any one point. But rather, these boundaries might more appropriately be viewed as the farthest extent of a sphere or a sphere of influence that radiated from one or more of these centers of authority, such as those that I've just mentioned, Kyiv, Chernihiv, etc., etc. And not surprisingly, these spheres of influence often overlapped. And they were continually waxing and waning, depending on the ability of the rulers in the center to enforce their respective authority over what they claimed to be their realm. Now, as for Volodymyr, his foreign policy were in marked contrast to those of his father, Sviatoslav. Instead of looking southward toward the Bulgarian kingdom, or also Khaganate, and Byzantium, which is what Sviatoslav and many of his predecessors looked, Volodymyr now instead concentrated primarily on the lands of the East Slavs to the north and to the northeast. And after bringing several far-flung lands under his control, military control at least, Volodymyr tried to resolve the problem of authority over these peripheral regions, certainly those way up in the north, and to resolve that problem by placing his several sons to rule as the local rulers and representatives of the dynasty, again, whose senior member or grand prince was in the city of Kyiv. Now, because of Volodymyr's ability to demand and to obtain the respect of his sons, Kyivan Rus did experience a sense of political unity during this relatively long reign of 35 years of Volodymyr. Political unity based on these familial ties through the descendants of Volodymyr was also reinforced on what we might call the ideological front. The ideological front. At Volodymyr's initiative, plans were undertaken already early in his reign to establish a kind of pantheon of pagan gods, headed by one called Perun. Perun. And why? Well, this was, first of all, the Varangians were pagans. And so now let's make this the official religion, if you will, of the state, of Rus. But we should also keep in mind that Rus was surrounded by peoples with more advanced religions. Christianity, for instance, among the Poles in the West, and the eastern form of Christianity in the Byzantine Empire to the south. There was Islam among the Volga Bulgars to the north, way up here. And then there was Judaism, at least represented by some of the ruling Khagans of the Khazar Khaganate to the southeast. Now, the existence of these faiths, Christianity, Islam, Judaism, among the peoples neighboring to the Rus realm, and often sometimes representing strong political entities, in particular the Byzantine Empire, all of that could not help but have an influence on the ambitious Volodymyr. Of these three faiths, Christianity was perhaps the best known to the Rus. Volodymyr's grandmother, Olha, as we saw last time, had converted to Christianity, as a result of which a church was established or built in Kyiv itself, already in the late 9th century. And besides that, Christianity had made inroads along the periphery of the Rus realm, in particular in the far west, among a group of considered East Slavic borderland, nonetheless tribal group called the White Croats, just north of the Carpathians. So Christianity was already there, and a principality that was going to be called Galicia. Also, Christianity had made its presence down here in that outpost of Tmutorokan. So Christianity was known. It was, in fact, however, the possibility of an alliance with the great East Roman Empire, Byzantium. It was that which prompted Volodymyr to reject the recently established pagan pantheon that he initiated in favor of the comparatively more complex Eastern Christian religion from Byzantium. Sometime between 986 and 989, actually the date was chosen to be 988, Volodymyr was converted by Byzantine Greek missionaries to Christianity. And in return, he received the daughter of the Byzantine emperor as his wife. Very important. This pagan barbarian is now married to the daughter of the East Roman emperor. And as a result of all of those agreements, he introduced, at least nominally, Christianity in all the lands under his control. And this last act came to be known as the baptism of Rus, symbolically associated with, as I said, the year 988. Christianity now provided a unified ideology for all the Rus lands. Now, despite his own military success, the establishment of political authority to the persons of his sons, the introduction of a unified ideology in the form of paganism first and then later Christianity, despite all of this, Volodymyr was also faced with an external threat, the numerous invasions from the southeast, primarily by the nomadic peoples now, another one of these Turkic peoples called the Pechenegs. Another one in the long line. However, this threat from the Pechenegs was now turned into a political advantage. How? Well, it gave Volodymyr an opportunity to call upon all the, what now are Christian Rus people, to struggle against those infidel Pechenegs. The inhabitants of Rus now had a sense of common purpose to protect the Rus faith and the Rus people. Now, considering the political environment in Kyivan Rus, it is not surprising that Volodymyr's death in 1015 was followed by what? A civil war among his many sons. But in the end, two contenders among those sons, a man named Yaroslav from the north, who now then controlled Kiev, and his brother, Mstislav, who was actually way down here in Tmutorokan, in that outpost, but now moved to Chernihiv. So now we have the two brothers in Kiev and nearby Chernihiv, in the center of Rus. After 1024, these two brothers remained at peace because they also struggled against each other, which is normal in the beginning. But they remained at peace, and for all intents and purposes, they divided the realm or their sphere of influence along the Dnieper River. And in cooperation or cooperating together, they recaptured the western borderlands of Rus, which the Polish kings had invaded. And they increased trade relations and the intensity of trade with Byzantium. This unity of the Kyivan realm was further strengthened in the year 1036, and that's why we have it here, because Mstislav, the brother, died suddenly, unexpectedly, and then Yaroslav now became the indisputable sovereign of all Rus, from Novgorod way in the north to Tmutorokan way down in the south. Like his predecessors, Yaroslav chose not to remain in Novgorod, but to make Kyiv once again the realm's political and cultural capital of Rus. Yaroslav's first action was directed against that external threat, those Pechenegs, who themselves had become victims of the traditional nomadic experience in the steppe. Or what was that traditional nomadic experience? One tribal group came from the east, they spend their time in the open steppe, and then another one comes from the east, pushes them out, and then they control the steppe. And that next one, after the Pechenegs, was known as the Polovtsians. The Polovtsians, Kipchak, Kumans, known by various names. Slavic name, Polovtsians. In the face of the Polovtsian pressure, those Pechenegs moved north. This is also a typical thing. They moved north, try to capture Kiev. That doesn't work. They are defeated by a Rus army, in this case by Yaroslav. And what is important here is that the Pechenegs establish another tradition. So they can't get into Kiev. They're defeated by Yaroslav. Some of them then flee farther westward, into Hungary, by the way. Present-day Hungary. Others decide to go live along the Ros River. We've seen that river important on our maps. And it is basically the farthest extent of the Rus realm before the open steppe. And they settle there, but they start to cooperate with the Rus and for all intents and purposes become frontier defense people in alliance with the Rus. So some of these Turkic people flee entirely, others remain along the Ros River, and they take up the name which is known as the Black Caps, or the Chorni Klobuki. Former nomadic peoples now settled along the Ros River, and cooperate and protect that frontier for the Rus. And in that sense, the Pechenegs, and then we're going to see the same happens to the Polovtsians and other Turkic peoples, came to play an important role in Rus politics, even marrying into Rus princely families, and as I said, serving as mercenaries for Rus as a whole, and also for different princes of the realm of Rus. Now, aside from the removal of the Pecheneg danger on the southern steppe, Yaroslav and his son also subdued the Finnic tribes in the north, brought them under Rus hegemony. We have heard about the Finnic tribes up here, going way back to when the Varangians first came. Yaroslav, on the other hand, was less successful against Byzantium. He carried out raids against Byzantium, usually over conflicts about trade and privileges or non-privileges. He even led a large fleet of ships to attack Constantinople, but was roundly defeated in 1043. Now, whether or not Yaroslav was always successful against his foreign neighbors, he did consistently carry out a policy of marital diplomacy. Marital diplomacy. As an example, his first wife was the daughter of the king of Sweden. His second wife, Anna, the daughter of the Byzantine emperor. His Western European ties were especially strong. He married off his daughters, one to the king of Hungary, another to the king of Norway, another, Anna, to the king of France. So Rus was totally integrated into the European royal world. No different from any other state in Europe. It was one Europe. Yaroslav is remembered, however, not only for his military victories, his foreign relations, his marital diplomacy, and the beautification of the city of Kyiv, which we'll talk about when we discuss cultural matters. He's also remembered as the first ruler of the Rus realm to have a law code drawn up and used throughout the realm. This was known as the Pravda Ruskaya, or the Rus law, the Rus law. In an otherwise brutal era, the Rus law code was noted for its mild punishments, mostly calling for varying kinds of payments instead of imprisonment, no capital punishment, for example. And it was because of his diplomatic skills and this legal codification, by the way, the first written law code in any Slavic land. For these reasons, Yaroslav came to be known in Rus history as the Wise. Yaroslav the Wise. Well, he hoped to impact some of that, or import or instill some of his wisdom among his sons. Following the Kyivan tradition, he divided the realm among his sons, and although he called upon them, in the words of the primary chronicle, quote unquote, to love one another, well, that's nice. We know what the story is, or what the answer is, or what happened. They disregarded his warnings more, and as a result, more than half a century of civil strife was the result. So the whole second half of the 11th century, there's strife between his various sons, these various rulers of the various principalities in the Kyiv realm. That very same period also witnessed a sharp increase in the number of attacks by the Polovtsians, especially between 1060 and 1068. They ravaged the entire land here of Pechenegs on the doorsteps of Kyiv itself. This Polovtsian danger and the interprincely feuds, in which, by the way, the Polovtsians were used by different Rus princes, so it's not like all Polovtsians against all Rus. But that situation became so serious that the Prince of Chernihiv, a man named Volodymyr, with the epithet Monomach, called upon all the other reigning princes to meet at a council. So bad was it, 1097, and the council meets in a town called Lyubech which is not far from Chernihiv, actually, just north of Chernihiv, and therefore up farther north up the Dnieper River from Kiev. So they all meet, and this council came to be known as the Council of Lubech, agreed on a new principle for succession. Or maybe you can put it another way, it just simply codified in law that which had in practice existed. That is, the Kievan throne was no longer to be considered the senior position, and as such would no longer be given to the oldest son, while the other lands went to the younger ones. Instead, each of these lands or principalities would have its own dynasty, to begin with the first generation of Yaroslav's descendants. And so, in the end, any idea of a unified political realm was now abandoned. And in its place was to be a confederation of principalities, as I said, each with its own dynasty, based on one of the sons of Yaroslav. Now, the other purpose of this Lubech Council, Lubech Diet, was to establish a common defense against those heathen Polovtsians. And as a result of a unified effort between 1110 and 1113, the Rus princes did in effect finally break the power of the Polovtsians, holding them in check for the next half century. This new political order, governed by princely diets, Lubech was the first of them, would meet whenever necessary and even set a model for resolving interprincely disputes. But this new order set by the Lubech Diet was short-lived. After the death of the Prince of Kiev in 1113, the city experienced riots. The local assembly, the Vicha in Kiev, meets, decides to cross these recently established dynastic boundaries of each principality and to invite the hero of the wars against the Polovtsians, this Volodymyr Monomach. And again, one of these invitations, who was in Pechenegs, to come to rule over them. Volodymyr Monomach accepts the offer, and between 1113 and 1125, he rules again as now senior prince, grand prince, Volodymyr II Monomach. Subsequently, large parts of the old realm of Rus, as a result of his efforts, are brought under the control of one prince in Kiev. And to consolidate his authority and to satisfy Kiev's discontented population, because they're the ones that revolted, Monomach expands the Rus law code of Yaroslav the Wise. And also, following in the tradition of Yaroslav, he extends his dynasty's relations with the rest of Europe. And finally, the Polovtsians were quiet on the steppes. All of these factors which made Volodymyr Monomach's rule and his immediate successor the last period of stability in the history of Kyivan Rus. Let us now, when that period ends in 1132, turn with a few last words today about this third era of, we're calling it disintegration, 1132 to 1240. During the first 3 decades of this era, 1132 to 1169, that's why I put this date here in the middle, the political and economic influence of the city of Kiev declined rapidly, so that city Kiev seemed to be little more than a symbolic object of contention for the whole host of otherwise relatively weak rulers who claimed the title of Grand Prince. For example, during the 2.5 centuries of Kyivan Rus up until now, from the 870s to 1132, there had been only 14 grand princes, senior princes, 14, 3 centuries. But in those 3 short decades that I'm now just talking about, 1132 to 1169, the title changed 18 times. So you can see the degree of instability. During this era of internal disintegration, it was the northern principalities, Novgorod and Rostov-Suzdal, in the far north, Novgorod and Rostov-Suzdal, which were among the first to rebel. And before long, war broke out throughout all of the Rus principalities. During this period of general disintegration, 3 new principalities managed to attain a considerable degree of internal stability. They had some strong princes, and eventual power and influence over their warring neighbors. And those 3 areas were Galicia and Volhynia in the west, Novgorod in the north, and Rostov-Suzdal in the northeast. It was actually Volodymyr Monomach's grandson, a man named Andrei, known as Bogoliubskii, allegedly the lover of God because he was such a fervent Christian. We'll see what kind of activity he engaged in. His conduct set the tone for this era of disintegration. In that year, 1169, and that's why I'm using it here, this prince who ruled up there in the northeast, in the Rostov-Suzdal, organized a coalition of leaders. Those leaders marched southward and attacked Kiev and destroyed it. They sack it, they pillage it, they burn all its churches and its monasteries. They massacre its population. Now, warring Rus princes had fought for Kiev before, but none had ever treated it as if it were a foreign city, in the way that this coalition under Bogoliubskii did. And unlike his Rus predecessors from the north, whether going back to Oleg in the 9th century, or Volodymyr the Great at the end of the 10th century, or Yaroslav the Wise, all of whom ruled in the north in Novgorod, and then came to Kiev and made it the center. They fought for it, and then established their residence there. Not Andrei Bogoliubskii. He assumes the title of Grand Prince of the Rus realm, but instead he makes his capital Vladimir in the northern province of Rostov-Suzdal. And so, by the end of the 12th century, the 1100s, well before the appearance of a new force of destructive invaders from the east, the Mongols, we'll get to that. Long before that, Kiev had lost its political significance. Instead, 3 new power centers from within the realm of Rus were to replace Kiev. One of these, as I said, was Galicia, Volhynia in the west, which was to maintain the Kievan heritage within the lands of present-day Ukraine. Another was Novgorod in the far north, which had become a powerful and independent commercial center linked to the economy of the Baltic Sea and the Germanic Hanseatic League. The third comprised the principalities of Rostov-Suzdal, which now was renamed Vladimir Suzdal. And these there were to form the basis of a new political and cultural entity that was eventually to develop into one of the dominant powers in Eastern Europe, that is, out of Vladimir Suzdal, the Duchy of Muscovy. So we will end here, and you'll have to wait one full week because there's some kind of holiday in between. So happy Thanksgiving. Enjoy. And see you 1 week from today.